Welcome, everybody. I welcome you to this Explorer session of today. Today, we have three PhD candidates from Brazil. Well, actually, I don't know if they're in Brazil right now, but they are the research, I think it's all about Brazil. They will let us know. Let me introduce you to them. But first of all, thank you for accepting this Explorer's invitation. For us, it's a pleasure to have you here. We have today with us Lívia Bernardes Roberge. I hope I'm saying that in the right way. She has a BA in International Relations as well as a BA in History. In 2017, she obtained an MA degree in History at the Universidade Federal Fluminense. In 2018, she started a History PhD at the Universidade Federal de Minas Gerais under supervision of Professor Silvia Liebel. Her research is about the 17th century English diggers and their involvement in the Wars of the Three Kingdoms. She's interested in the process of how they came to self-fashion and represent themselves as the diggers, and how we can understand identity formation and dispute as part of the political disputes of the wars. Between 2020 and 2022, Livia was a visiting researcher at the University of Sheffield under supervision of Professor Michael Braddick, and she's currently an academic in residence at the Elmbridge Museum working on a project about the diggers. We also have with us Igor Lemos Moreira. Igor is a PhD candidate at the Santa Catarina State University in the line of research on politics of memory and historical narratives under the guidance of Professor Ricardo Santiago. He was a visiting scholar at the University of Miami from 2021 to 2022. He has also a master and graduated in history from the Santa Catarina State University. He was or is a CAPES scholarship holder, member of the Image and Sound Lab at the Exile and Migration Studies Center from the Federal University of Minas Gerais, the Center for Studies in Music and Media, and he has experience in history of present time, history of the Americas, public history, history theory, and contemporary history. Since his experience as an undergrad, Igor has worked at the interface between present and time history, public history, and the universe of languages, artistic and digital, seeking to understand the different ways in which temporary and identity in Latin America are experienced and represented in the cultural industries. He is currently working at his doctoral dissertation on the artistic trajectory of the Cuban singer Gloria Estefan and her multiple engagements. And last but not least, we have with us today Lucas Avelar. Lucas is a digital history PhD and graduate research assistant at Clemson University. He investigates issues of spatial history, placemaking, narratives of time in the built environment, and cultural identity. Lucas holds an MA in public history and historic preservation from Colorado State University. His thesis entitled Invented Past, Imagined Futures, World Fairs, Cities and Narratives of Brazilian Nationhood in the Built Environment, 1893-1976, dealt with the maturation of Brazil's modern nationhood in the late 19th century and 20th centuries by examining the spatial narrative of world's fairs as microcosms of modernity and ideologies of national identity. As part of the inaugural cohort of the Digital History PhD program at Clemson University, Lucas is currently engaging with methodologies of digital humanities and geographic information systems to further expand his research on the intersections between space and time in urban and cultural landscapes. And finally, I'm your host, Jimena Perry. Everybody knows me already. Guys, thank you again for being here, and the floor is yours.
I think maybe Livia can start and we go like on the flyer.
Yes. We can go Livia, Igor, and Lucas, if that's okay with you.
Yeah, but I think Livia.
So if you want, you can go ahead, Igor, and then when Livia comes back, she goes second.
Yeah. Let me just share my screen. Oh, Livia is back. Livia? Livia?
Hi, I'm sorry, my today. Hi.
Hello, we can hear you.
Yeah.
Maybe
Would someone else?
Let's go with Igor.
If I
Let's go with
whilst I
Igor.
try- Thank you.
Okay.
We'll share my screen. Just 1 second, guys. And now I think it's sharing.
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, thanks. So thank you all for being here today. Thank you also to Jimena to organize this live or this online meeting. And today I'm going to present a part of a sample of my PhD dissertation in history. I'm doing my PhD history in Santa Catarina State University in Brazil, and my focus on my object is the Gloria Stefan artistic trajectory or artistic life or something we can call like this. But today my idea is to try to talk a little bit about how Gloria Stefan became a symbol of the exiled Cuban and Cuban community on one specific episode. And this episode is actually Gloria Stefan's first travel as artist to Cuba and Guantanamo in 1995. So I have like a paper to read. It's a little bit short, but let's go. In just 1 second. Okay. In the first weeks, just 1 second. Okay. In the first weeks of September 1995, the exiled Cuban singer Gloria Stefan visited the naval base at Guantanamo, along with artists such as Andy Garcia and Israel Cachao, both Cuban exiled people. The main object was the performance of a 2-hour presentation for approximately 10,000 people in the military base. Although among the people were there were members of the US military and diplomatic force who live or work at Guantanamo, most of the others that followed the performance were Cubans who were waiting for authorization to leave Cuba for the United States. When publishing a photograph of the singer in Guantanamo Bay on September 1st, the newspaper's Gazette, one of the main communications vehicles circulating in the region, narrated details about Gloria Stefan's experience on the island, stating that she had gone through an intensive schedule with interviews and testimonies for television, newspapers, and radio stations. Gloria Stefan's performance at Guantanamo made the singer's first performance on the island of Cuba, was motivated by a series of political factors, global factors, and the singer's professional interests. In the 90s, he is recognized by the historiography of Cuban Revolution as a time of economical, political, and social crisis, a phase called by specialists and scholars as a special period of times of peace. With the fall with the socialist bloc, Cuba lost not only its main support, but among the consequences of economic crisis was the intensification of waves of exile descent, mostly to the US, due to the existence of laws that facilitated the entries of Cubans into the country. However, the not authorization of most of these Cubans to leave the country ended up generating a new crisis of humanitarian proportions, beginning a large movement of undocumented departures from Cuba through rafts. The raft crisis mobilized several intellectuals, artists, politicians, and activists around Cuban politics and the issues of the exile. Added to this is the moves by President Bill Clinton to make the rules for visa to Cubans arriving to the country more flexible through the reformulation of the Cuban Adjustment Act. When Gloria Stefan decided to perform in Guantanamo with the support and partnership of the US government and the military base, this was the scenario. In the final moments of the show in Guantanamo, the artist addressed to the audience describing how thrilled she was to return to Cuba stating that for her, the US base on the island was part of the Cuban territory. In her speech, which preceded the performance of the song Mi Tierra, the singer highlighted that it was a moment of temporary return to the country, but that she was waiting for everyone who was part of the audience in the United States and had expectations of one day return to Cuba. Just one second. By mentioning the wait for the exiled Cuban in the United States, the artist has not only speaking for herself, but also posing as a representative of the exiled community and indirectly as a form of US spokesperson, using the pronoun we. Such speech demonstrates a central element of the entire trip and performance. The artist's voice was the elaboration of a Cuban American identity for which she felt and she was the spokesperson. The speech, quite brief and interrupted by walking from one side to the other on the stage, demonstrated the synthesis of the narrative and the intentions of Gloria Stefan's visit to the naval base. Her trip was not only intended to promote her music, but was permitted by political intentions to reinforce a constant narrative since the Cuban Revolution in which the United States placed itself in a position of solidarity or protectionism with those who wanted to leave the country. Gloria Stefan's speech, as well as her show, encouraged this narrative seeking to build three complementary and intrinsic representations. The United States as a savior nation, the Cuba as a corrupted country that needed, in the artist's eyes, to become free, as in the 14th and the 15th, and the idea that the Cuban and Latino community need to united globally. Gloria Stefan's final speech on the show was a key mechanism in this process. The message, which served as a form of guidance to the audience, was constantly repeated through the performance. But when it was delivered before the Mi Tierra song, it was enhanced by the song's symbolism. Mi Tierra is a song that talks about the emotional ties of belonging to Cuba, but that evokes a dreamer, which no longer exists. The utopia presented in the song forms a narrative about the pre-revolutionary Cuba past. In this sense, the song narrative has an engagement connotation by evoking not only a country that is no longer present, but by lamenting about a nation promise that is not fulfilled. In a way, the land that's represented in the is a ruin located by the sound, but also by the veggies in the country and by Gloria Stefan. Certainly, one of the most impressive points of the show is the dialogue with the audience, as well as the volume of people who were part of it. Throughout the performance, it is noticed that the spectators who follow the show held burners in honor to the singer. At different times, the editing process of the recording of the show focused on people singing standard songs in chorus, praising to the singer or dancing. Throughout the show, the audience participation and the song presented mobilized relationships that can be interpreted between archive and repertory. For Diana Taylor, archives would be writing records, a form of bond fixed in time through the act of recording, while the repertory is the living manifest of such memories, a form of constant experience of temporality that occurs through the performance. According to Taylor, the performance act unites archive and repertory in a complementary way. During the show in Guantanamo, part of the relationship between archive and repertory was due to the relationship between the public memory and the manifested performance. The voice that saw collectively in this sense, mobilized the relationship, seeking to create a bond of belonging to a nation that was not only invented, but that on that occasion became to live only in the performance itself and in the temporality that fixed the representation about Cuba and about the exile. Clark Stephan concert proposal was also incorporated in the stage, which featured a large bench of exiled Cuban artists, including musicians and back vocals, in addition to a film crew that traveled through all space. All the band members wore white clothes, which may have been true as a trait of simplicity, but also a reinforce of the relationship with the Yoruba culture, considering that on more than one occasion through her life, Gloria mentioned her connections with such practice. Some customs, especially the musicians, had Cubans and US flags are thrown in crisscross, parting with words like Cuban America, reinforcing a narrative that linked Cuban exile to the United States. Through Gloria Stephan concert at Guantanamo, the relationship between Cuba and the United States is thematized, either through songs or through speech. However, this process is not the opposite, but complements the construction of a narrative about Cuba that reinforces the anti-cultural oppositions of the singer, the US, and the exiled community. The sequence or the script of the show has a central in this regard, including the representation of traditional Cuban songs, such as Guantanamera, music that used poems of José Martí, which was performed along with a track called Montuno by Gloria Stephan, in that thematized the Cuban musical genre itself. Such reference elements were fundamental in the construction of representations, narratives, and the political, cultural, and social project itself that symbolize the singer's trip, and Andy Garcia and Israel Cachao to Guantanamo to perform the show. Such references taking up the idea of the archive for Diana Taylor was central to manifest the artist's repertoire in the theoretical and artistic sense of the word, which gave her performance political meanings and the mobilization of multiple temporalities in the search for reinforce their belonging and that the exiled communities in time. And now, just to close, Gloria Stephan concert at Guantanamo marked the Cuban process of economic and cultural opening generated by this special period in times of peace. Before the singer visited in 1995, other exiled and publicity anti-Castro artists had arrived visited the US military base in the country, like Celia Cruz, 4 years before. Like Cruz, Gloria Stephan visited local spaces, gave interviews, and presented a show for Cubans who wanted to leave the country with similar proposals. To publicize their productions articulated to build a narrative that reinforced the rule of the United States as a nation that would welcome all those who wish to leave Cuba. Interconnected, the 2 points covered the reaffirmation of an anti-Castro and anti-revolutionary narrative that integrates the very negation that permits Cuban exile after the Cuban Revolution. In the case of Gloria Stephan, this narrative had presented itself in different ways since joining the Miami Sound Machine Band. Initially, her production represents the exile condition as a nostalgic sensation, as this continuity with her organization of expeditions, and with a very nation and with which she identifies. We can call this like Cubanness or Cubanity. In the 19th, the nostalgic narrative remaining but as a solo artist, this representation began to assume more defined political contours, presented especially in songs and speeches that reinforced the possibility of one day returning to Cuba when Fidel Castro left the power. The concert held in 1995 demonstrates such intentionally, considering that it took place on a US military base at the time when the singer was releasing an album that sought to promote Latino identification or Latinx identification globally, in which Cuba was going through a process of social, political, cultural, and economic reorganization. The songs presented the media coverage, the audience participation, and other elements that were highlighted in this presentation provides elements to contextualize and reflect on this process that crosses the singer career, but which concerns different cultural networks existing in Latin America. Through this analysis of the performance, we can see how the artist moved between Cuba and the United States in the artistic dimension. But like other artists, she was a fundamental person from the political point of view to the United States and for the international organizations like the United Nations. Among elements that move from memories to performance, archives to repertory, networks to civilizations, Gloria Estefan make it possible to reflect about the central role of the exile artist in the construction of narratives about Cuba in the present times. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Igor, for your presentation. I would suggest that we wait until all the three of you had presented, and then we can start the questions. Do you agree? Okay, so Livia, the floor is yours.
And thank you very much. I'm so sorry for all the internet problems. I hope you can hear me well now.
Yes.
Is it all
yes.
right? Yeah, okay.
Perfect.
I'm gonna share my screen just a second. Okay.
Are you able to?
Yeah, I'm just getting to it.
Okay. Yes.
Can you see that?
Yes.
Okay. Just a second. Okay. So I am, like Jimena said, I am at UFMG, which is in Brazil, but I'm afraid I do not history or Latin American history. But I do work with some theoretical approaches quite close to what Igor has explored in his research. And because we're talking more about public history, I'm going to be addressing my research, but I'm mostly be focusing on a project that I'm currently developing with a museum in England, to focus a little bit on how he fill that bridge, that gap between academia and the wider public. So thank you once again very much for the opportunity to be here today. It's a pleasure. I'd like to address the diggers, but who were the diggers? So in a very summarized way, one of many radical groups in England during a period that we call the Wars of the Three Kingdoms, that took place between 1640 and 1660. One, because these wars encompassed England, Scotland, and Ireland. So the diggers, they were a small group, not very well organized, but they emerged in England after King Charles I was executed by Parliament after being trialed for treason against the English people. And then England became a Commonwealth, became a republic of sorts, with Oliver Cromwell as its head of state, and merged in this very chaotic and very loud trying to sort of fill in this of all these noises, that all these voices that were speaking up together alongside this period, where people were all wondering what path should England follow in the aftermath of the regicide, because the republic was not a consensus, but even how this republic should work was also not a consensus. So the Diggers were one of in this context that were sort of disputing how they thought that England should be from now on. First appeared in 1649, and their characteristics were that they strongly the monarchy. They believed all men to be men, always important to notice that. They proposed that land, they had this idea that land was nothing but a given by God to mankind to be enjoyed and freely. So ultimately, they were against the very idea of private possession of the land that was slowly starting to be built in England and Scotland and Ireland within the same context. This is the scenario where the private property is being built, and they're going against it. They're going on the other way around, arguing that land should be freely used by all. Alongside that, they also fostered some very radical beliefs in the way of being not Catholic, but being Christians, but being anti-clerical, which meant that they did not believe in the power of bishops. They did not believe in hierarchies in church. They did not believe in the necessity of actually building churches or temples to worship God. They believed that you worshipped God, that you should worship God within yourself. God, for the Diggers, was a sort of an inner light that should be shared and worshipped within yourself. And the way that they acted as a group was by publishing several pamphlets where they disclosed and addressed all these matters, and why they thought the earth should be enjoyed this way, what was to not have a monarchy anymore, why sided with Parliament, and many other things like that, as well as promoting agrarian occupations in the countryside in England, more specifically in a region called Surrey, which is today the borough of Elmbridge. In these occupations, they aimed to actually put in practice their idea of communal ownership of land. So they ate together, they were building houses, and these were sorts of demonstrations of if everyone freely opened themselves to this possibility of using the land and gave up freely the property that they held. But one thing that has always attracted my attention about the Diggers was why they were called the Diggers. Because many of these radical groups that existed in England in such scenario, such as the Levellers, the Diggers, the Ranters, the Fifth Monarchists, and so on, they were usually nicknamed. They were given names. They usually put up a strong fight and resisted being labeled like that. For example, this other group called the Levellers to this day, but if we read their pamphlets, if we see the transcripts of this themselves, they would always called the Levellers, but they were not, because the word leveler entailed the idea of leveling everyone's inequalities, and they were against that. But the Diggers were actually nicknamed Diggers, but instead of saying they embraced that label, and they refashioned and disputed what this representation meant, and they added a new meaning. In the 17th century in England, basically meant a rural, ignorant rural worker, which was this idea that their enemies sought to mock diggers. But what they did was reclaim that and say, yes, we are diggers, we are simple workers and all that, but we are fighting, we are the chosen people of God. So they added this new meaning to it. And what I find particularly interesting is that this of such label did not stop in the 17th century. If we look to the end of the 19th century to the 20th century in general, and also now we find many communist and social broader groups, political groups that are somewhere on the left side of things, claiming the diggers ancestors of their causes. So three of such movements. One was the Wigan Diggers, who are a group in the UK who promote festivals and lectures and all sorts of things about the diggers, and they label themselves diggers. I've spoken to the San Francisco Diggers, which was a social artistic movement in San Francisco throughout the 60s, 1960s, 1970s, culture and all that, who also have been diggers. And also to the Land is Ours is a British movement about access to land and land rights and equality, who do not call themselves diggers in particular, but they do mobilize this and their story quite a lot in their discourses. So I was interested, even though my PhD research 17th century diggers as a side gig, in the trajectory of such label, and to understand what it used to mean and what it came to mean in the present time. So we see this association of the diggers with the left, and there's some ideals of the left that are very communists and socialists, and to some extent to even anarchists, that actually the diggers did not foster, they did not defend that. We see some, as a historian, we see some very anachronistic references to the diggers and some anachronistic the diggers. And it made me think about how relate to this. And that's how the Diggers Project began. It's made by myself and a team at Elmbridge Museum, which is a museum in England, in Surrey. Why this is the place where the diggers would have lived and acted. So I saw that they had some things about the diggers on their website, and I reached out to them. Look, I am investigating the diggers, I'm researching them. Is there any way I can contribute to the museum, the website? And they were, lucky me, they were actually very interested in actually doing something new about the diggers. So we started as a few items to it. A blog series that I am writing in a website that we made as part of the project. And in all these blog posts, we different aspects of the diggers, why they were called so, how they resonate with the broader history of Surrey, social movements that claim to them, but also justify this idea of nothing but proto-communists from the 17th century, in an accessible, interesting way. Diggers as they weren't, and that they had religious beliefs, they were quite plural. They were not a very organized movement as we would think nowadays when thinking about a social movement. And so we're writing this in the most accessible images. We are making videos. We have exploring the diggers also in the language, using all these resources. We are trying to be available to the wider public, encompassing all these reappropriations that diggers went through in the 20th century, but all for their history in the 17th century and their own words and their own sources that they left for us, so forth. So in addition to the videos and to the blog posts, also we made some learning resources for secondary schools, which encompass workshops, worksheets, videos. So schools in Surrey can actually start teaching about the dig in schools. So we have a workshop about early modern print and pamphlets and how to make pamphlets, and also some videos. We also have the videos on our YouTube channel that I mentioned before. There are 5 videos. They're quite short, but also trying to make all this knowledge that sometimes we use within academia more approachable, more And the Diggers Trail. What is the Diggers Trail? The Diggers Trail is a trail that exists in Surrey in England that marks some of the places where the diggers actually passed by and that had some sort of importance for the movement. But this was a very old-fashioned trail. The information boards were quite old-fashioned. I have some pictures. They had some information that actually was not wrong, but was also not really accurate. They were it's quite hard to actually do the trail because you couldn't find it on Google Maps. The maps were not very clear. This today, these are all from the early 90s, if I'm not mistaken. So another part of our project is to also revitalize these information boards. I've written a series of information boards as well, and IT team that is fantastic, and they've put these QR codes on the new ones, so you can do the trail and you can scan with your phone, and you can not only access the diggers webpage from the museum and get more information about them if you want to. Google Maps now, so you can actually use Google Maps to do the trails. It's very interactive. They have very bright illustrations now, so to it, and these should all be installed by summer 2023, hopefully. So July 2023, this should all be replaced. And then we have the final ends in this mosaic to the diggers in Cobham, which is one of the cities where they had one of these occupations. Just include one of the goals that we had with this project was to sort of, I always thought a historian working so unequal as Brazil was, how can we make the historical knowledge that we are working on within universities, how can we make it accessible? How can we show people that why it matters and how it matters, how this is connected to their daily lives, why studying history at a doctoral level, and also how can we actually make an effort as historians, not necessarily historians, but impacted by history. Because I do believe it's also been my belief that history for the creation of a wealthy, rich, and healthy as physical infrastructure, buildings, bridges, so on and so forth. So what we are doing with this project is trying to, bridge that gap between academia and the wider public. And it's based in Surrey because I think people remind ourselves of local history is also important, but also because of the connotation of the diggers and their connections with the left and communist movements all around the world. I do think that it's all this new material about them that's more updated, that takes a bit more care, that's a bit more careful with anachronism. And if anyone's interested, that's our website, and if anyone would like to contact to do so, also available by email. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Livia, very much for that project. It looks really, really interesting. Thanks again. Now, Lucas, I'll give you the floor.
All right, I'm gonna share my screen and hopefully this will work. It should. Can everybody see that or? Okay. All right, so thanks again, Jimena, for putting this together. This is such a great opportunity to talk about what I've been doing and hear about what other PhD students in history have been doing around the world, especially Brazilian PhD students, which I hold very dear to my heart because, I feel detached being so far away from home. So it's always good to have some sort of sense of what is going on in Brazil and at home and with people in my field. So thanks for that, Livia and Igor. So again, my name is Lucas. I am a first-year digital history PhD student here at Clemson University. And I actually want to take this opportunity to say that our PhD program just started. So that's exciting news for the field of digital history. It's the first program in this sense here in the US. So it's been really a great experience to be part of this first cohort and see where the field is heading. So I just want to give a huge shout out to Clemson University for that. And then that being said, I want to give a short overview of my research that I started to develop as a master's student at Colorado State University. And I am now thinking of possible ways to expand the same research during my doctoral program here at Clemson. I want to say this is going to be quite quick, and I'm going to show you some complex connections. So I'm sorry in advance for the rush, but I want to have the chance to let you know the process that I went through to get to my research topic. And then I can tell you about some of the findings or the things that I found out with this research that I hold so dear to my heart. So while I was still a master's student, I talked about how space and place are created and reimagined by statecraft agents to create and contest narratives of nationhood. So that's where political uses of the past can be discussed, right? So I look at the case of Brazil's ideologies of national identity and how they were showcased in different spaces and different times, in particular during World's Fairs. There used to be these big international events in which countries would build their own pavilions and exhibits, and then exhibit commodities and material culture. So when I first lived, and when I still lived in Rio, actually, I worked for 2 years in the state parliament, and my commute to work included biking through an empty square called Mahatma Gandhi Square. That's the square you guys are seeing in the screen. That is where the former Senate at the federal level used to be when Rio still was the capital. And Rio was the federal district until 1960. So as you can see, it's not there anymore. The Senate, it's gone. So this palace that you can see now on the screen, it disappeared from the square. So the name of the palace was the Monroe Palace. It is kind of a site of memory. That's how I look at it. It was constructed in 1906 in the Avenida Central, or Central Avenue, one of the most important avenues in the city. And the palace was a contributing element to the overall architectural landscape of the area. So you can see the smaller picture is the Central Avenue. And at the end of it, you can see a little bit of the Monroe Palace. And to the right, you can see another building that is kind of like the same architectural style. And they all combine, contributed to this overall understanding of Belle Epoque district in Rio, right? So the palace was demolished in 1976, and there's like a void in left behind in that square, right? So it always disturbed me, not because I found the palace pretty or liked the previous landscape better or anything, but because I am aware of how people, things, objects are connected through time and space. So that palace, I was always sure it meant something to the people of Rio. It was part of people's everyday life, commute to work, and how they experience time and space. It was someone's workplace, just as the Tiradentes Palace, where I worked, was my workspace, where the Parliament for Rio de Janeiro is situated today. So why it was destroyed? When I decided to investigate this history of how the palace was destroyed, I was driven by 4 decades of emptiness and what I call in my research a deafening historical silence of the square. And I spent hours in the archives of Rio trying to make sense of that process until I realized that my own research questions were very limited. I was so focused on how and why the palace was destroyed that I missed some sort of like a bigger picture. And the archives were pointing to a much deeper and century-long process instead. So the palace, I started to see that the palace was kind of like a historical artifact, and it was material evidence of change over time. I learned from the archives that the walls and the stairways of the palace, they connected Brazil and the United States, and they connected past and future all in just one piece. What I saw in the files of the archives in Rio made me want to move beyond the empty square. And I realized that to understand the process of how the palace went down, I needed to follow the story of how it traveled through time and space. And this is how I ended up deciding to do graduate school in the United States. So let me tell you that this palace is somehow connected to at least 6 different places and 7 different moments in time. The first version of the palace was designated for the World's Fair in Chicago in 1893. And then the same architect who designed the first version also designed the second version that was built for the fair in St. Louis in 1904, 11 years later. The same materials used to raise the building in St. Louis were shipped to Rio de Janeiro after the end of the fair, and then used to rebuild the same palace in 1906, the exactly same materials. Walls, stairways, cupola, all of it. In 1922, the palace was part of the World's Fair in Rio. It actually housed the administration of the fair. As a result of political and economic changes in Brazil, an antagonistic version of the palace, completely different architectural style, was raised in the World's Fair in New York in 1939, almost against what the palace represented back in Rio. Almost a complete shift in the ideologies of Brazilian nationhood and cultural identity. In 1958, the first World's Fair after the Second World War happened in Brussels, where the United Nations was established, and the pavilion representing Brazil was very focused on promoting a new urban ideal. And that new urban ideal glorified the project of the new federal district, an entire new city that was at the time being constructed in the central region of Brazil. The city is called Brasilia. In 1960, this new federal district, Brasilia, was finally inaugurated, and Rio lost completely the status of capital city or cidade capital. And that's when the palace back in Rio, the Monroe Palace, started to suffer a gradual but very violent loss of meaning and functions, of course, because it got emptied. So it housed the Senate for 30 years, and now the Senate had been transferred to the new capital in Brasilia, and then it was empty. It wasn't really serving any functions. So in 1976, the palace went down. So I coined this concept of disembodied building to talk about this spatial and temporal connection. I was really fascinated by the fact that the physical building itself actually traveled through time and space from St. Louis to Rio. But knowing that at least the first conceptualization of the building was in Chicago, I realized that something else was also moving, not only the building, not only the physical materials, but something more, something less tangible, something more abstract, a disembodied version of the building that I call disembodied national building. This disembodied building represented the narratives of nationhood conveyed in the built environment through the pavilions of the World's Fairs, but also through the city of Brasilia, and ultimately through the empty public square that is called Mahatma Gandhi today. So it is a sad and quite tragic irony, because the disembodied building that I'm calling here ended up being the reason why the physical building went down after all, because the ideas of nationhood in the 1970s were not compatible with the meanings that were embedded in the physical palace, and it had to go down. So in 2015, this is a really interesting thing that happened. Under the coordination of the stenographer Daniela Solon, the magazine Imagem Tempo created a setup and with the boundaries of the former Monroe Palace at the square where it used to be. And the action involved the general public and citizens passing in the area, and it resulted in a collective discussion about permanency and impermanency of the built environment in the urban landscape. So I just thought that was a really cool memory / history and public participation situation. So this is a little passage from my own research so that we can talk about this disembodied idea. So for every time and space through which it existed, the disembodied national building acquired different meanings that reflected broader political, economic, and cultural circumstances in Brazil, and often responded to particular nation building narratives of the United States. So here is where we can see that not only the past can be used for political and economic reasons, but also the future. So let's go through the different manifestations that this disembodied building had in the physical world real quick. And hopefully you all will understand better what I mean about political uses of the past. So the first manifestation in the physical realm of the disembodied national building was in Chicago in 1893. During the fair, this disembodied building responded to the necessity of inventing a republican tradition for the country after the proclamation of the Republic in 1889. It was federalist, republican, and democratic in its values. It represented all of those values in its architecture and design. It presented some sort of common origin story with the United States, with a lot of symbols representing the Pax Romana, the laws, the Roman laws that the US also inherited. And it had like this European inherited past. So the past is being mobilized in Chicago to make Brazil, the Republican regime in Brazil, validated in the eyes of international communities. The second, it's still in Chicago, the spatial narrative was not really accommodating this narrative that Brazil brought, right? So it was the country's debut on the stage of modernity, but it was cut short by the spatial narrative of the fair itself, because the fair had this unifying language that kind of homogenized South or Latin American countries. So the narrative that Brazil brought to Chicago actually was not good enough to showcase this Republican narrative that ultimately should be enhancing the Brazilian participation in the fair. It was kind of like hidden amongst the other Latin American nations. And then in St. Louis in 1904, the very same meanings once expressed in Chicago were now put forth to reinforce the country's readiness to forget the dark past of colonization and enslavement and move forward as a republic. So the palace was bigger, improved, better located than in Chicago. It had French and American ideals of liberty, equality, and democracy. It provided a welcoming environment for immigrants with a lot of coffee, for example, for the visitors, and a lot of actual information about how to immigrate to Brazil. And it was based on this idea of illusion of progress. I wish I could actually take the time to go further in the architectural details and show you which features in the architecture represent each of those points, but we don't have that time. but just trust me, this is literally the findings, right? So in the research, I found out that the architecture would mean something like that. In St. Louis, though, the spatial narrative of the fair was also something to consider, right? So not like in Chicago, I had the opportunity to create this map with geographic information systems. So I built this map myself, collecting spatial data at Forest Park in St. Louis. As you can see, this is the park today. And the current map of this the city in St. Louis is overlaid with the historical map of the fair in 1904. The fair was a little bit to the left, and it took part a little bit of Washington University campus on the top left of the fair today. So Brazil is right here. Oops, this red point right here. It's close to Cuba. It's close to Nicaragua, Mexico, Great Britain, Holland, Sweden, Austria, France, but also close to Puerto Rico, Guatemala, India, Argentina, and Italy. So Brazil's building was literally the highest pavilion on the grounds. If you look at the international foreign grounds from this point right here, which is the entry and one of the entrances to the fair, the first thing you would see is the Brazilian cupola. So it kind of stood out among other Latin American nations, and they're smaller, architecturally simpler, and less ambitious pavilions. And this really played along with the Brazilian national identity and the narrative that Brazil brought to St. Louis, right? So it was in favor of the narrative that Brazil brought to St. Louis this time, differently than Chicago. The physical building actually was dismantled, as I said, and transported to Rio, where it was rebuilt in 1906. And through the next 6 decades, it housed the Third Pan American Conference, the National Parliament, the National Library, ultimately the Federal Senate. So it was really interesting that this building got demolished twice, once in St. Louis and then in Rio in 1976. Before that, of course, in 1922, it was part of the World's Fair in Rio. So the statecraft agents sought a new narrative about what it means to be Brazilian and the Brazilian cultural identity and nationhood. So these agents, architects, engineers, politicians, all of them, they sought a nationalistic and more authentic narrative of time that embraced colonial traditions. So while the physical construction was now called Monroe Palace, housed the Fair Administration Office, the disembodied building manifested its new attributed meanings in the spatial narrative of the event with strong presence of the new colonial architectural style. So in this picture, you see the entrance to the fair with a new colonial arch, and right after the entrance, you see the Monroe Palace right there. I also built a map, or tried, at least I started, I hope to keep working on that, for the World's Fair in Rio. So as you can see, this is the airport, Santos Dumont in Rio today. And then this is where the fair happened. I also overlaid the fair map. There's an inversion of power relations with the United States when we look at this map. The spatial analysis with ArcGIS Pro and Geographic Information Systems tells us that the second closest pavilion to the Monroe Palace was the United States Pavilion. It's right here. And this is the Monroe Palace right here. The closest was Argentina. And then you have some sort of modernization or modernizing tradition, right, that played along with the architectural style. A strong political proximity between United States and Brazil in this time. And now there's an emphasis on what made Brazil unique in face of other modern nations. And another thing that we can see interestingly in this map is the prominence of Portugal. When you click on it, you should be able to see the attributes for each of the nations. And Portugal's was a new colonial style palace, a really big one in comparison to any other palace. And that's quite interesting considering that the whole idea of the 1920s in Brazil is to try to adopt the colonial tradition as part of the nationhood narrative. So Portugal got some sort of prominence in that. New York in 1939 is completely different because that's where you have a shift in what you're talking about. You're not talking about past or colonization or colonial times anymore. You're talking about the future, modernization, industrial development. You're now mobilizing the future and trying to obscure the colonial past. There is a complete rejection of the new colonial motives and style that were once used in Rio, and they embrace modernist, sober, and functionalist architecture. There's also this idea embedded in the pavilion of tropical modernism. So a lot of yards, a lot of open areas with a lot of tropical plants and all of that. In Brussels in 1958, right after the World War II, the pavilion sought to define the image of JK's Brazil abroad. So JK was our president in that moment, in 1958. And he coined this idea of national developmentalism. So it was pretty much based on very strong industrial development all the time. And the Red Balloon and the film Le Ballon Rouge, if you know this French movie, it's a movie about urban development in Paris, right? It really showcases Paris as a subject or an individual. Paris is almost like the main character of the movie. And this little kid is running in Paris street with a red balloon all the time. So the red balloon on top of the building, the Brazilian building, kind of makes reference of this new urban development ideal, pre-based in Paris, but also adapted to the Latin American reality. So the exhibit was about Brasilia in the center of the pavilion. As soon as you got in 1958, you could see this huge exhibit about Brasilia that was being constructed. So the main character of this exhibit, the main character showcased in this fair for Brazil was Brasilia, was like the proudest achievement of JK's Brazil. And then Brasilia itself, right? 2 years later in 1960, it was finally inaugurated. Brasilia, the city, was completely antagonistic to Rio de Janeiro as a cidade capital, as the capital city. It meant the repudiation of everything that used to represent Brazilian nationhood or Brazilian cultural identity, what I call Brazilianness or Brasilidade in the first half of the 20th century. It was completely sober, futuristic, orderly planned, controlled, and it's distant from the hectic presence of the people in the Southeast. So it's also some sort of less democratic version of a federal district as it used to be in Rio, that was so close to the center, the urban areas and the population, right? So you can see also a picture from Brasilia up above in the bottom left of the screen. It actually has a shape of a plane. So that's how far modernist architecture went in planning and controlling the built environment. So that's something that I also wrote in my research. It was not only a clash between urban models, but also a dispute in the symbolic field of production between modernity and modernization, the former civilizing Occidental and European, and the latter functional, sober, and industrially developed. It was also the expression of the dispute between ideological projects of Brazilian nationhood. So here I just have a very short comparison of what used to be the Senate in Rio, the Monroe Palace, and then the new Senate in Brasilia. So two different ideas of nation. And of course, I'm not going to play this video, but there's a movie from Roberto Carlos. This is a singer, very well known in Latin America. In this movie, he kind of like goes around flying in Rio, and you can see, the architectural landscape of the city and in the area in 1976, right before the demolition or the destruction of the palace. So it was dismantled in January 1976 after a very long nomination process that passed through every department of the National Institute for Historic and Artistic Heritage, the IFAN, and members of the institute recommended the preservation of the entire architectural conduct on the Central Avenue that was later named Avenida Rio Branco or Rio Branco Avenue, for the historic significance and association with the Belle Époque Carioca in the 1900s. So that's quite interesting. I wanted to point that out because, there's a clash also in the public realm and public discussions happening between intellectual elites about the importance of that palace and the importance of those buildings representing a specific time and space in Rio. And some people agreed that it should be preserved. Other people thought that it should go because it did not represent the ideals of Brazilian cultural identity anymore. So that's really interesting. The modernizing role of the military dictatorship in 1964 until 1985 played a huge role in defining the fate of that palace. Because of the national developmentalism that I mentioned, that started with JK, the president, adopted in the 1950s, this national developmentalism was enhanced during the military regime. And then the dictatorship rejected the invented traditions of the beginning of the century. So they mobilized a completely different idea of past. There was almost no past in the government's agenda. It was all based towards the future. It was all about the future and modernization, strong industrial development, strong progress, urban progress, and very little rural progress, actually, or in rural areas, there was little attention to it. So the federal government's active efforts to erase the status of Rio as a capital city and promote Brasilia as the image of the country was ultimately determined the fate of the palace. The Geisel itself, Geisel himself, the president and dictator in 1976 was the one who said, was the last person to say that the palace should go down. And it was actually his order. So it came from above. And then the palace actually fell. It fell. And then you have some pictures here of workers, mostly Black people, working to demolish the palace. And this is the last slide, just an overall conclusion. What does this history tell us? I wrote that the process through which the abstract and disembodied national building matured into a new future-oriented ideology of national identity speaks to more profound disputes in the symbolic field of production between different narratives of the Brazilian past and future. I think the history of the Monroe Palace in the physical world and the disembodied ideological national construction probably for me illustrates how Brazil mobilized narratives of time, ideas of past and future through space and place to convey ideas of modernity, modernization, colonial heritage, or Republican tradition to the Western international community. And I'm gonna stop right here.
Thank you, Lucas. That was really, really interesting. I myself, I have studied world fairs and I have never seen the overlapping on the mapping that you did with digital tools. I think that's pretty cool. So I'm just gonna let people from the audience, if you want to just open your mics and jump in with a question, or if you want to write the question down, I can also read that question for our presenters. While people gets the courage to ask. I have some questions for you. They're very basic questions because, of course, you are the experts. Igor, I have two questions for you, but they're basically like more of curiosity. They're not like academic questions, but more curiosity. I don't know. I mean, this is just like, I don't know if I'm going on a tangent or something, but I don't know if you have heard the Cuban singers Gente de Zona? Have you heard the song they have about the revolution, Patria y Vida, a song that came out in 2020? I want to know what you think about that song, but then I have another question also related to the concert of Gloria Estefan in Guantanamo. Can you tell us a little bit about Castro's reaction to that? Did he allow that concert? How was like all the reaction for that? And for Livia, I have a question. You mentioned that the project you are making available for schools and for children and for teaching. Is there any kind of public study of publics, or do you have some statistics, or do you know how people have been reacting to the project? It has been well received. Do you have any kind of feedback, etc.? And for Lucas, well, I really like your project, Lucas. I wish you the best of it. But I have, you mentioned something that I think it's very trendy right now in Latin America. Perhaps you're acquainted that we are talking about for memories for the future. There's a lot of discussion about that, like, okay, memories are from the past, but then how can they serve the future? And you mentioned that several times in your research. So I would like you to elaborate a little bit more on that and tell us more, like how the palace and your research is going to help. I mean, what's the contribution to that discussion about memories for the future, that I know it's very trendy right now in Colombia and in Mexico, like, but of course it's a different kind of thing. And also, I'm also curious, Lucas, if you think the removal and destroying of some statues in recent years is related or not with the same kind of phenomenon that you saw with the palace. So you can answer in any order, and I encourage the people from the audience who are still here to also post their questions. If you want to start, Igor?
Yeah, of course. I know Pate Vida, and Pate Vida was released. I think a lot of people forget about this, but Pate Vida was released almost at the same time of the song called Basta Ya from another group.
I
But
don't know the other one.
Pate Vida is very, very interesting because the music, the song represented the crisis of two generations in Cuba. You have like one generation in Cuba who was formed, like the old generation was formed and grew up in the revolutionary context, like in the 16th, 17th, the 18th. So they have like some ideas of country, some ideas of the revolution itself. And Patavida talks more with the new generation who has some things to talk about the revolution, like racism, homophobia, and a lot of things like this. But Patavida for me is not so new. If we
Okay.
if we heard a lot of songs was released before Patavida.
Mhm.
I think that the thing about Pata Vida is that they release Pata Vida in a political context, really delicate, and you have like the use of Pata Vida for some political issues during July of the other year, like 2 years ago, I
Yes.
think. So you have more like the idea of using Pata Vida more than the meanings of the song. And the Cuban exile community used that, for example, like I was in Miami when the Cuban community recognized like Pata Vida as a symbol for the Cuban exile community. They give like awards to this to the writers of the song. So they make like I'm almost used to call this like song monuments or monument songs. Like you make a song being a monument, like Jacques Legoff called like a document in a document and a monument at the same time, because this song talks more about like how people deals with some frustrations and some ideas of the revolution. And about Castro, Gloria is particularly like interesting in this point because we can look to Celia, we can look to Andy Garcia, we can look to more Albita Rodriguez or even Camila Cabello, and no one have like the connection with Castro than Gloria Stefan. It's not like a connection like proximity. It's like if Gloria Stefan, when Castro was alive, if Gloria Stefan talk something about Cuba, Castro almost always responded to this. So in the 19th, a little bit before doing the concert in Guantanamo, Gloria was invited Gloria participated in the U.S. legacy in one of the United Nations Assembly, represented the United States. And Castro talks with the Cuban delegacy, like, don't talk with her. Don't talk with La Bailarina. It wasn't like the name. Castro doesn't like say Gloria, and never. But at some point when Gloria became so big, Castro sent like people to the US to buy Gloria Estefan records and gave to him to hear and know with. But about the Guantanamo show, I don't have like until now any records about Castro talk about this. Probably he doesn't say anything on that moment because it was in Guantanamo and not in like Havana or something like this. But at that time, she was like forbidden to enter in Cuba. She was like on a list that people who can enter in Cuba. But I don't have like Castro talk about this, but I have like documents talking about how Gloria Estefan records was selling in Cuba, like in the black market and things like this. So Castro never talks about the show until the documents I have, but he hates Gloria. More than one time he say like, I don't like her, she's not Cuba, she's like a manipulative person for the US, like in the Elian Gonzalez case. In the Elian Gonzalez case was one of the first moments that Castro and Gloria talks. Like Gloria says something in the newspaper, and in the day next, Castro says something, Gloria says something. This going on. So I don't know if I responded to your question.
Yes.
but-
You answered, Igor. Thank you. That was really, really interesting. Thank you so much. Livia?
Thank you for the question, Jimena. So actually, our website is still pretty much under construction. We haven't finished uploading blogs. There's going to be 7 blogs. We haven't finished uploading all the workshops. So we still don't have that sort of data of how many people are actually downloading it and all that. But one way in which we could maybe perhaps good, maybe measure that is July we did a talks to disclose the project and to disclose the new website, because the website was launched back in July. Spoke at several local history societies in Surrey. He spoke at some and stuff like that, and actually went to our talks. Was quite overwhelming. Was a very big number, and lots of already knew about the existence of the diggers, which was something that we quite sure how many people local from Surrey actually were, but it was very interesting because their approach to it was all, oh yeah, the diggers, the communists. And so we have a way of measuring this engagement in terms of this outturn for the had talks, and around 50 people turned up for each and made questions and hopefully accessed the website. One thing that we still haven't been able to put up, which we're wanting our IT team to do, is to open up a comment box, a comment session after each blog, so people can actually, say it's rubbish, ask questions, so on and so forth. But I did have some, because of there's my email as well, and I did have some people on Twitter coming to find me and asking me further questions, or for saying nice things about the project and praising the initiative. But unfortunately, we still don't have the numbers of, let's say, secondary school teachers that are actually using the material. But it is quite interesting because the museum has they do provide a service of going to secondary and, you know, doing history box days and stuff like that. So in Surrey, they do have a quite close contact with these teachers and these schools and all that. So they are slowly disclosing for schools that we have all this material that can also be used and all that. So I think hopefully once everything is with the website, we'll maybe be able to have a better idea of numbers and terms of engagement.
Thank you, Livia, very much. Yes, I know these kinds of things take time because they build slowly, but I'm sure you'll get a pretty good response because it's a very solid project. It's very interesting. Congratulations, by the way, and thank you for sharing it with us today. Lucas?
Thank you.
Yeah, so I'm trying to come up with like an answer, just one answer for both questions at the same time. I think they're really connected. I would say that understanding like a history like this one about this palace, but any sort of like removal of monuments or buildings or changes in the cultural and urban landscape, it tells us something about how people experience time through space. That's not something I am quite addressing in my research yet, but I think it's a really prominent way to understand how or why specific monuments or specific constructions affect positively or negatively some groups or social groups or cultural groups, right? So if something is being changed, it is a product of its time. Something is happening at the moment that is causing this change in the urban landscape, in the cultural and urban landscape, and architectural landscape as well. So about the monuments removal, I think it shows that the history serves political and economic goals. That's the first thing. We cannot forget that for sure. It's always serving private and public interests. And this is why public history is so important, so that historians can engage in those activities outside of academia and then can participate in debates that are already happening with or without us. So we got to either be part of them or reject them completely, which is not a possibility. And it shows, for sure it shows that, but it also, when it comes to like tough memories, right? Monuments that are related to violent pasts, I think it's more about how different societal norms or social structures are going through changes over time, and then some sort of historical awareness about those pasts is emerging from specific groups that suffered violent experiences, colonization, enslavement, or whatever. And then you have these groups coming up with a new understanding of how the past should work for them and not against them. So a Confederate monument, for example, in Montgomery, Alabama, is not speaking in favor of African Americans. And then you have this whole idea of removing a monument that it's of course a contradictory, or it's complicated. It's a complex situation when it comes to preservation, historic preservation. But we should understand that nothing is static, nothing is petrified in time. We're preserving for the people. So preservation should also address change and moving forward. Moving memories for the future is addressing the possible changes, right? So I am not saying go out there and remove all the Confederate monuments with your own bare hands. But whenever that happens, I am not opposing myself to it, because I think this is part of a historical process itself. It's the history of the monument, of how it rose, stayed, and then went down. This is the history we will tell. This is the history we take to schools, the history we take to the museums. We can talk about the process, the whole historical process of change in the social mindset about enslavement and about African Americans' history and culture through the history of a monument that was raised and then went down. So taking down a monument does not erase history, or it also does not erase memory. It actually enhances memory and it enhances history because it calls people attention. It calls the general public to pay attention to the historical process that is happening at the moment of the removal. So they will look back at the past to understand, why is this monument being conflicted? Why is this monument being removed anyways? So the whole history of the monument can tell us a story. And I think that's the case of the palace, not necessarily about enslavement or African culture or African history, but definitely about values, about what it means to be Brazilian, what it means to be a Republican regime, or to have a Republican regime, democracy, or do we want a country that is based in a colonial tradition and it's proud of its colonial heritage, or do we want to move past the colonialism? Do we want to move past the Republican ideologies of, elites first and workers below? This is like what bringing the palace down can enhance in the public debate. This is the kind of question that we have in the public debate because of the palace being taken down.
Thank you, Lucas, very much. I think you mentioned something like that's really important. It's like preservation is about change. And I think some historians, not only historians, but social scientists and humanists have to really remember that sometimes. So I don't know if there's any questions or any observations from the audience that's still here with us. If not, I would like to thank you on behalf of the International Federation for Public History for accepting this invitation. This was really great, and I'm sure the video is gonna be like well watched. I just want to invite you to our next Explorers presentation that's gonna be about public history in Japan. I will announce it. And thank you again very much for being here and for sharing your work with us.